Virtual reality is an old concept which started to evolve in the 30s. The concept originally was described around theater, but in years it changed. Now VR is more described as a tool and what it displays. Today, VR equipment is accessible to anyone and becomes extremely popular among researchers and developers. VR helps one to immerse and feel more present in media experience that it is shown. Although most will never believe what is happening in VR, the goal of it is to stimulate person to extent that matches or even overcomes the real-world experiences. We took the concept of suspension of disbelief as a measurement. Suspension of disbelief can be described as one's willingness to ignore elements that are not helping in persuasion. Our goal for suspension of disbelief was to eliminate elements that causes person to not to believe the experience. The idea was born to implement passive haptic and atmospheric sensations into VR narrative to remove one more element that can cause disbelief. We started by developing a narrative that followed the traditional arc. Narrative started with exposition, the rising of action that led to a climax point. After, we began to develop VR environment where passive haptics and atmospheric stimulus had their part. The hope was that such implementation would enhance the effect of constructed narrative. The concept of virtual body embodiment was considered. It was taken as another element that can help to remove person's disbelief. Leap motion was attached to VR headset. Tracking of real hands helped to create VR hands that were moved in sync. Patient started by sitting in an empty office waiting for his psychiatrist to come. Meanwhile, each participant could interact with elements and freely look around. When psychiatrist came back, she started showing Rorschach pictures that stimulated the patient. It was made so that each participant could touch the paper.
Good.
In narrative, the third picture triggered the patient, and he was mentally transformed to a forest. At this time, participants could feel the cool wind of the forest. Big spiders started approaching, which led to a climax point of the narrative. Participant was mentally transferred back to the office. Here, psychiatrist showed the last picture, which also triggered the patient.
You know that I'm here to help you.
I'm counting that.
We set out to a task to measure difference between two conditions: experience that is enhanced by the haptic and atmospheric stimuli, and a standard experience without such elements. The measurement point was chosen to be narrative climax point, at which we chose to not directly stimulate participant by passive haptics. Goal was to see whether haptics enhanced story would affect the impact of narrative climax point. This would suggest that haptics and atmospheric stimuli can directly affect the effect of narrative. Experimental group included moving and switching of the lights and wind, movement of the table, paper that simulates picture movement in VR world. Stress ball object was glued to the top of the table to match what was seen or touched in VR. Experimental group participants were physically able to touch the table, while the control group had no such possibility. 3 methods were used to gather the results: 2 questionnaires before and after the experience, psychophysical measurements and observations that were written down systematically. Majority of the participants were also filmed. Empathic wristband was used to gather heart rate and skin conductance data. Heart rate was measured to be higher in the control group when comparing baseline and climax points of both groups, although the difference was not statistically significant. Data of skin conductance was meaningless as it did not show any logical pattern that could be related to the narrative or other elements. Questionnaire results were more various, although overall experience had no statistical difference as well. However, the enjoyment of experience in the experimental group managed to get a statistically significant positive difference. Observed body language showed that participants were reacting to the narrative. It was also noticed that participants in experimental group were interacting and testing the environment much more than the participants in the control group. Majority of participants in the control group tested haptic possibilities at the beginning of experience and stopped trying soon after. Observations clearly showed that reaction of body language between participants were very different, suggesting that each participant responded differently to the same narrative. Future work would try to replicate this experiment with precise measurement devices, with hope to get better results. Our results were extremely hard to evaluate, and one reason could be that participants were constantly moving the arm on which empatica was worn. Results sometimes would show dramatic heart rate changes that are likely to be not possible for real human to experience. That was considered to be a movement artifact rather than a real heart rate. Similar happened with skin conductance data.